Hello, welcome to another installment of the 007 Files. I'm Bill Koenig. I'll be your host for today. We are talking to the proprietors of the SpyHards podcast, which has posted more than 200 episodes, plus additional episodes for their Patreon page. And while they cover spies in all forms, from very lightweight to very light comedy to very dark tales, they've done a lot of James Bond stuff, and we will concentrate on that in this episode. They are Agent Scott and Cam the Provocateur, also known as Scott Hardy and Cam Smith. Guys, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Well, sure. Thanks, Bill. Thanks for having us here. I'm Scott Hardy. You can tell I'm me because I'm the British person in this conversation.
Yes, and I'm Cam. As you said, Cam Smith from Vancouver, BC. And I like to think we do have lightweight episodes, especially when we're covering Condor Man, the lightest of all heroes, soaring through the sky.
We're the lightweights, I think, really, if anything.
Well, that's true as well,
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But, Bill, thanks for having us.
Well, you have episodes featuring Bob Hope and Red Skelton, and that's like two names you don't think of with spy movies.
But people should.
Scott's favorite episodes.
Oh, man.
Well, they should, yes. But as I said, a lot of your episodes deal with James Bond. And for example, in addition to doing reviews of Bond films, you have interviewed the likes of Luciano Paluzzi, Denise Richards, Bruce Glover, Lana Wood, and one we will touch on more later, but a MGM executive named Jeff Kleeman, who worked on the first three Brosnan films, and I thought was one of your best interviews. We'll get into that later, but briefly, of all your output, how much would you say Bond accounts for? A quarter? A third?
If you were to consult my social media, it's 50%. If you were to look at our actual output, it's probably about 20%.
Okay.
Yeah. It's because we cover, a Bond movie maybe every, 2 months, but that doesn't mean there isn't interviews and specials that drop here and there as well. So, and plus over on the Patreon, we might be covering Ian Fleming biopics and things like that.
Well, as we record this, it's May 1st, and earlier this week you came out with an episode about the man with the golden gun, and next week you're going to have an interview with Robert Sellers, actually first of two parts, I gather, who wrote The Battle for Bond and When Harry Met Cubby and other books about Bond. So there's a lot of Bond material there. Anyway, so I thought this would be a good fodder for this podcast as a result. Let me just start briefly. How did you guys get together, and what gave you the idea of doing a spy podcast in the beginning?
I don't know him.
Yeah. Who is this guy you've paired me with?
The podcast started 5 years ago. We're about to have our 5th anniversary in the summer this year, which is a mind-boggling statistic anyway, which I'm sure we'll come back to. Cam and I have been friends since the early 2010s. We met in Las Vegas, Nevada at a Star Trek convention of all places. So not even in either of our home countries, and not about the franchise that we speak on podcasts about. We have a mutual love of Star Trek. And then over the years, we figured out we have a mutual love of James Bond and then spy movies.
Yeah, and it was during the pandemic, because this was a pandemic project when it started, and we were like, well, we have all the time in the world to put into this podcast, and nothing will ever change in terms of time. Yeah, it started because Scott was doing a rewatch of the Bond movies, and I was a Bond fan obsessively since a very young age, and I was just on WhatsApp messaging back and forth with Scott through every movie he was watching with all the details. And it kind of became this conversation of like, well, maybe we should do a podcast. I already was doing a Star Trek podcast that's ongoing, Subspace Transmissions. But, the idea of maybe doing a Bond podcast came up. And the reason we didn't was we said, well, if we do Bond, we can only do Bond. And that's, 25 films or, however many at that point it was. And then, you've got the two kind of offbeat outliers there. And so we thought, okay, well, hold on. If you expand it and do spy movies, then we could talk about Bourne, Mission Impossible, Condor Man, all these options that suddenly felt a lot more.
I'm glad
like,
Cam is
exciting.
the one to bring up Condor Man, because I'm often accused of talking about that film too much, if anything. The other thing of it too, I mean, yes, it is important that, there are only 27 films, right? 25, 27, or there's some outliers you could perhaps add Casino Royale 54 if you want to get into that. There are about 1,000 plus spy movies that have been made of all time. And frankly, once you've spoken about the Bond films once, what more have you got to say after that? So our show would have ran for 27 weeks at best. Whereas now it can basically run for years and years and years, and we can pepper in the odd Bond film every 3-6 months and do it that way and get our Bond fix. I mean, the interviews, we'll talk about that, I'm sure, but that was not the plan originally. That was not part of the scheme. We kind of fell into that accidentally.
Well, let me ask you this. What would you say is the importance of James Bond films to the cinema spy genre in general? Because you guys are like more qualified than a lot of others to comment on that general question.
I'm glad you say that, because it's taken us 5 years to gain that qualification. So I hold it up next to my bachelor's degree. That's nice. I feel like this is just me talking off the cuff. Cam, you can jump in with your answer as well. I feel like James Bond is like the fast food version of spy movies. Not that it hasn't got its sort of like nuanced moments, but if you're going to try pizza for the first time, you're probably going to get a Pizza Hut or a Domino's or something like that. You're not going to go to some fancy sourdough place, where it's like all kinds of weird ingredients. You're going to just have a Domino's. And so and that's also appeals to a lot of people. So James Bond is kind of going for that approach. It satisfies a lot of people, appeals to a lot of people. But if you want to get more nuanced, you could try all types of different things. You could also make that analogy for ice cream. And that's probably a better analogy than pizza. But for some reason, I must just be hungry.
Yeah, like I would say that Bond is sort of the magnet at the center of the genre. Bond is typically what pulls people in. It's always attractive to people. People always want to know what's going on with Bond. They look to the past of Bond and say, like giant volcano bases and, Jaws in space and all these various elements that immediately stand out when people think of the spy genre. But because it's at the center, people tend to not look too far beyond that sometimes. And you can put aside franchises like Mission Impossible and Bourne, which are very noisy and often pitched as sort of alternates to Bond, but at the edges, there's so much out there, so much. Scott and I cover all the time a plethora of World War II propaganda films that are spy movies, or you've got Hitchcock stuff, and North by Northwest is the big one, but there's several others. There's just all these different types of spy movies circling around, often drawing on Bond, but Bond also draws on a lot of them as well for inspiration.
Well, specifically From Russia with Love, the most obvious example of how it draws from other sources is North by Northwest with the crop duster sequence. And in, I guess it was the early 90s, there was the Criterion so-called band commentaries, these laser discs were put out with commentaries, and they hadn't actually run it by Eon, so they got stripped out. But over ensuing years, you can actually hear the audio of those commentaries. And Terrence Young, the director from Russia with Love, admitted that the helicopter attack on Bond was taken from North by Northwest. I forget the exact quote, but he says it's so obvious or something like that. But there was something else where in From Russia with Love, on 4 occasions, the recognition code comes into play, where Bond encounters an agent and this whole thing about cigarette lighters and matches and all that stuff. And you hear the full recognition code twice, but it comes into play 2 more times. But you don't hear it again because the audience has already heard this. In North by Northwest, the audience is ahead of Cary Grant for most of the movie. And then finally he gets caught up on the tarmac of the Chicago airport, and he's talking to Leo G. Carroll. But for much of the sequence, the audience doesn't hear the dialogue. You just hear airplane noises. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that was the screenwriter, Ernest Lehman, said, there's nothing more boring than a exposition scene. So he came up with that idea. It's like, the audience sees Cary Grant react to Leo G. Carroll, And then when we get to new information, now all of a sudden you can hear the dialogue. And so with From Russia with Love, the last two times the recognition code comes into play. The first time is when Captain Nash is intercepted by Grant, and Grant gets him into the men's room where he kills him. And then Grant comes out, and then he pretends to be Nash, and Connery Bond, he's fumbling with the cigarettes and stuff. So, I mean, it's a technique that I think was clearly also taken from Russia with Love, but it's a lot more subtle than the crop duster thing.
Well, you could trace that back further anyway. When North by Northwest came out, they were writing the screenplay for what was supposed to have been the Thunderball movie. And you mentioned the Robert Sellers interview, which we're putting out next week at the time of recording this. We get into that quite deeply, but also it's in his book, The Battle for Bond. You can read all about it. But basically, North by Northwest was a touchstone for them creating what would have been the first ever James Bond screenplay anyway. So North by Northwest is baked into James Bond. They even approached Alfred Hitchcock to direct the first Bond. He wanted Jimmy Stewart to play 007. There is this whole other world where that happens. Yeah, North by Northwest is kind of has got a sort of parentage thing going on with Bond. There is a lineage there.
Yeah, and I think if like North by Northwest had spawned a franchise, then it might be regarded in a different way. Whereas because it's one movie from a master filmmaker who made many classics, when people think of the spy genre, they don't tend to gravitate their attention as much towards North by Northwest as they should. And then you can even look at, Notorious and The Lady Vanishes and Hitchcock's other spy films and see how he really popularized them as mainstream entertainments in a big way, and how something like Bond is following in that lineage and just making it more comic booky, bringing in elements that are a lot of fun for younger people. Like kids can really latch on to, Odd Job and Jaws and characters like that. It makes it feel like a more like kind of expansive world for people to have fun with.
Yes. Yes, indeed. And my own view of the 60s was, I think Bond, I've used this phrase in multiple posts on the Spy Command, Bond was the tide that lifted all boats, in the 60s, but the better, it created a market for spy things, but the better spy offshoots, they may have had, Bond created the market for them, but they had their own twists and turns and characters. Man from U.N.C.L.E., the original Mission Impossible TV show, the I Spy TV show, the Get Smart TV show. And in some ways, I think in the U.S., the TV shows were better than some of the movies that came out. But
yeah,
I mean, you start talking about like the Derek Flints or the Matt Helm series. The quality certainly is a drop down from Bond, but they all have their individual like qualities to them. A lot of people just dismiss them out of hand as spoof, but the first Derek Flint film, I think, has got a lot for people to enjoy if they like Bond.
Yeah, the Helms maybe not quite as much, but they have their time and place. But you can also understand why Bond moved past the 60s into the 70s, the 80s, the 90s to the modern day, whereas Matt Helm, Derek Flint, they're still hanging out back in the 60s until there's a new adaptation that maybe takes the source material in a different direction.
Well, roughly 50 years ago, John Le Carre appeared on the U.S. news magazine 60 Minutes. And I remember watching, I was in high school at the time, and he said something to the effect, he would have written all his novels anyway, but Bond helped create a market for people to want to seek them out because his novels were kind of like the anti-Bond and, much more down to earth. So he admitted that Bond helped his sales, although at the same time, he kind of crapped over the Bond character. Because at one point in the interview, he said something to the effect like, oh, yeah, the Russians could have turned Bond real easy. Just give him some more women and some more booze, and he would have been a traitor.
I was chatting to someone recently, I can't remember who it was, a friend of the show, the name's escaping me, and I'm sorry. But they basically said that their theory about sort of the Le Carre and all that sort of stuff is Bond is very much tied into that sort of youthful entertainment you like, especially when you're a kid. Bond's very good at getting you when you're a kid and sticking with you from then on. But stuff like Le Carré is better when you're an adult because you've seen how dark the world can be, so you can see that reflected in the sort of the materials you're digesting. Bond can be quite light and fluffy, whereas obviously the Daniel Craig films went their own way, and maybe that's a little bit of the Le Carré there. But we're all older men now from when we first saw our first Bond film, and I dare say that there's a few Le Carré novels that we might identify with more now than we did when perhaps if we read them when we were 10 or 15.
Or you could also add the pessimism of the Harry Palmer series and Len Deighton's spy novels. Obviously not named Harry Palmer in those books, but there is an element of maturity and pessimism to that character commenting on the realities of the spy world that don't really apply to the 00 program.
Well, which is interesting because Len Deighton did some work on From Russia with Love, no credit, but apparently he was in Istanbul when they were doing the location shooting there. And I saw a quote from a Richard Maybaum interview where he kind of dismissed Dayton's contributions. Apparently it was Harry Saltzman who sought Dayton out to do some work on the script. So anyway, let's talk about some of the interviews you've done. I mentioned some of the subjects. Let's talk about the actors you've talked to. I listened to the Luciana Paluzzi interview, which she's my favorite Bond woman, so of course I listened to it. But Lana Wood and the others, which of strictly the actor interviews, before we get to Jeff Kleeman, which ones did you like doing the best, or which one had comments that maybe caused you to raise your eyebrows, a la Roger Moore, something you hadn't heard before?
Interesting question. This might be not necessarily the answer you want to hear, or your listeners may not want to hear. And and I'll preface with the fact that Cam and I very much enjoy doing the interviews with the actors, especially like the Bond girls, because the Bond films are very important to us. We've both grown up on them, as I'm sure everyone listening has. And to get the opportunity to sit down with people like Luciana Paluzzi, Lana Wood, Jacqueline Bisset, Denise Richards, it doesn't escape us, and it frequently humbles us that these people continue to say yes to us for free. But what I get more out of, personally speaking, is when we talk to people who make films, directors, screenwriters, and the like. We've had Bond writers, Bond directors. We had Lee Tamahori on, who directed Die Another Day. I find that a more fulfilling process because I learn more about the craft of making films, which I think is really what ultimately is what I do this podcast for. Is I'm learning something every week, and I'm learning from them in an interview. Whereas when I'm interviewing actors, a lot of the time it's more talking about them in the film, and it's a different type of interview. But then a lot of people just want to hear those stories, like what was it like to hang out with Sean Connery? Who doesn't want to hear those stories? And I get it.
Yeah. When I think of the actor ones we've done, you're kind of like, in the case of Bond, or Scott and I are very familiar with Star Trek conventions. It's like, these Bond actors that are still with us, a lot of them are very used to the con circuit, and so they kind of have their greatest hits, if you will. And so the goal is to try to get them out of those greatest hit stories because they've mastered those. They know how to get on stage and tell them. And so when I look at the Denise Richards one, the thing that was the most exciting about that interview wasn't her talking about, working with Pierce Brosnan. It was her talking about the difficulties of the press tour and having just, being lambasted by the press for her performance and having to basically put on a brave face and go out there and face the world constantly at a very young age. People think of, I saw that movie when I was 19. I didn't think of Denise Richards as a young woman when I was watching the movie because she was probably 28 or something, 26. But I look at it now and I go, oh my God, I can't imagine someone that age dealing with that. And I can only imagine in a world with social media how that could be so much more amplified. So I look for those kinds of very human moments with the actors because sometimes they put on the performance and the goal is to try to get them to drop it. And even on a sillier note, because the Denise Richards one is, quite serious, Lana Wood was an absolute blast, and getting to talk to her about sharks and how her and her, grandson bonded over a love of sharks. And she was, texting or emailing us a photo later after the interview of her standing with a megalodon jaw. It's those types of moments that I really treasure. But those unfortunately don't tie into kind of the stories about shooting the pool scene, in Diamonds Are Forever.
I will also add, we do text, and I have texted Lana Wood a couple of times over the last year. I text Lana Wood because of this show, and that's something that doesn't feel quite right, but I still I get a little kick out of that.
Well, speaking of that, the Lana Wood interview, it was the first time I had heard that she had initially been cast to play Tiffany Case and then suddenly had to go for the lesser role of Plenty O'Toole. And there's this shows up in some Bond books. So apparently there was this mobbed up lawyer who contacted Cubby Broccoli trying to get Jill St. John a role in Diamonds Are Forever. Sidney Korshak was the lawyer, no longer with us. And I read that because years earlier I had read this New York Times series about Sidney Korshak. It ran on the front page for 4 days, and the Times sicked its leading investigative reporter at the time, Seymour Hersh. And I had just graduated high school. I'm reading this whoa. And then years later, I see that he had recommended Jill St. John get the role, and all of a sudden she's got the lead role in the movie. Oh, well, that's interesting. Which, well, I don't want to dwell on that too much, but it was interesting hearing her talk about going from number one female part to number two fairly quickly. Now all these years had passed, so she was more reflective, and that's show business kind of tone to it.
And just to speak to sort of the other half of your question about sort of getting those stories out of people and sort of what to sort of if you feel the need to edit or not. For me, it's their chance to talk about their Bond story, and I could see a lot of shows might chop interviews down to more concise, bite-sized things or make clips and stuff. But for me, and Cam, I know you agree, it's more about this is their story, and it's not really for us to chop it into pieces. If they say something to us and they want us to edit it out, well, we will do that for them. But ultimately, I'd rather it be long form so we can get those bits of information instead of them feeling like they've only got 5 minutes to tell their story. I want them to talk for an hour. We've had interviews that have run 2 hours before. With people that have worked on Bond, that are that passionate about it, still passionate about Bond and sharing their stories. And that's how you get stuff like the Lana Wood thing. That's how you get stuff like we had Jacqueline Bisset, who, if you don't remember, was Miss Good Thighs in Casino Royale 67, Academy Award-winning actress in her own right. I think it was an Academy Award. Cam can correct me if I'm wrong. I probably am. But she told us a story about the sort of the bullying on the set from Peter Sellers, and felt comfortable to sort of share the details of that too, and I'm glad people feel comfortable enough to share those things with us and with the listeners.
Yeah, or even when we talked to Luciana Paluzzi, we brought up The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and it was a very abrupt.
Yes, I heard.
Yeah, it was a very abrupt. I prefer not to talk about him. I've purged him from my mind, and we left it at that. And I remember talking to Scott after, do we keep that in? And we were like, you know what? She didn't say anything that seemed like it was going out on a ledge. It was that's how she felt. And so we'll just leave it at that. And it then, the listeners can hear and go, okay, that's how she felt about that. Let's move forward.
Well, and she also said that she had her differences with Adolfo Celli and had her differences with Claudine Auger. No, I thought, listening to that episode, I thought, well, you know what? That's what she feels, and it adds a dimension. It's more than the kind of PR kind of quotes. Anyway, but this leads me up to the Jeff Kleeman interview. And for our audience, Jeff Kleeman was an MGM executive. I guess they called it MGM UA at the time. And he worked as an executive on the first 3 Pierce Brosnan movies. You read that, well, Bond wasn't in a great place in 1994, but it's something else to actually hear it from somebody whose voice was in the room. He was among executives who wanted to go ahead with Bond, but there were other executives at the studio who were very skeptical. They had done market surveys, and it's Bond, what's Bond? It's oh. And it's something else to hear that, like I say, from someone who was in the room and who was dealing with it. So he and others were fighting to get GoldenEye going, but it wasn't easy. I know it was one of your most popular episodes of 2024. What was that interview like, and how did it come about?
Well, one thing is very important to me, and again, I'm speaking for Cam, but I know this is true, that you should always cite your sources. And I mean, I was aware of the chap already, but we were sort of given the contact details by a good friend of ours, a good friend of the show, Mark Altman, who's written some Bond books in his own right. He wrote Nobody Does It Better, The Unauthorized sort of History of James Bond, Oral History of James Bond, a great book people should pick up, and sort of helped us get in contact with Jeff. And because Jeff had given a couple of bits of information for the oral history, but he'd never done anything long form like this before. And so we pitched the interview. Let's talk about, let's sort of tell the history of the chapter in between License to Kill to GoldenEye, and then obviously GoldenEye to The World's Not Enough, which are the 3 films he worked on. And he was very much up for it. No one had ever asked him to do it before. And that's always exciting for us to get the yes, but also the yes from a story that's never been told. And that's really what sort of gets my blood pumping is newness. And so, yeah, we reached out.
That interview, and we loved, that everyone out there loved it, but like it would not have happened if it weren't for Mark Altman, who also co-hosts the Inglorious Trexperts podcast. He was invaluable. He made this happen for us. So we're forever indebted for that. But this interview is the type that I like. There's another one we actually did last year as well with Mitchell Lieb, who was a exec working in soundtracks at Disney, who had worked on the Mission Impossible 2 soundtrack. When you get these people that were in the room for all these crucial decisions, you get the best stories humanly possible. And Mitchell Lieb gave us a guided tour of the entire soundtrack industry for several decades and some crazy stories involving Tom Cruise and Limp Bizkit frontman Fred Durst that will forever occupy space in my head. But Jeff Kleeman did much of the same. He basically explained the entire nuts and bolts of the Bond franchise during the first 3 Brosnan films and was highlighting details, things that we'd always heard. For example, like the spin-off for Dr. Kaufman, for example, that was kind of this like rumored element. And he underlined, okay, here's what was actually going on with that. He, mentioned to the writer who was working on it. He referred to the Y. Lin film as well, and just the experiences of making GoldenEye happen. And it's kind of appropriate. Scott and I come from a kind of Star Trek background because people look at Star Trek films in the Shatner era or the, Next Generation era and think, well, those were big blockbuster films. And if you actually look at them or hear the behind the scenes, they were slashing the budgets almost every single movie. And the idea was, well, you know what? They have limited appeal. Let's just make them cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. And in a way, that's the way they were kind of looking at Bond at that point, post Timothy Dalton and the many years off because of the lawsuits, where it was like, well, we have to make a Bond film, but we're going to have to make it on limited finances and to really let creativity be our guide.
The Kleeman interview had so many great anecdotes, but a couple that stuck in my mind was Eon was still trying to go forward with Timothy Dalton, and the studio was not in favor of Timothy Dalton. The studio preferred Brosnan, but Brosnan wasn't a sure thing either because, he was several years removed from Remington Steele and he wasn't a big movie star. And as I recall the interview, he described a meeting with the studio and Eon, and finally Cubby Broccoli, I think he had a cane, he tapped it on the floor and said, okay, we're going with Pierce. And and again, there's an authenticity in that interview, knowing that Kleeman was in the room when that happened. I think it was a really insightful interview, and I think it was a coup that you were able to get him. And I know it's an interview you were both proud of, and you should be. But yeah, I think it was one of the highlights of your 2024 episodes.
The only way is down from here. But hey, we had our highs, didn't we? Our all-time highs. But and it was one of our most popular. Absolutely, a lot of people definitely enjoyed it. And we thank everyone that's ever tuned in and people that have shared it online. It's been nominated for an award for like best podcast episode, which is bonkers to me, and I hope it wins. But the fact it got nominated is just great enough in itself. Yeah, we're both ultimately, Cam and I left that interview and said that was a lot of fun. We got a lot out of it, and then we put it out, and everyone else got a lot out of it, and that's all we want from any of this.
The funny thing was the 2 episodes that were mentioned to us the most at the end of the year as highlights were the Jeff Kleeman episode and our film review of Possession, which is a 1981 body horror film that is truly unsettling, but it was kind of a good sum up of what SpyHards is.
Yeah, off the wall.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to wrap this up with what has become kind of the standard question I have toward the end of an episode. What was your reaction on February 20th when the Amazon news first came out that they were taking creative control of the Bond films? And have your views evolved since? I mean, we have some additional information since then. We know that Amy Pascal and another guy have been picked by Amazon to produce the first Amazon Bond movie. What's your view of the future of Bond movies?
The first thing I did was text you, Bill, because we were lining up an emergency episode to get a bunch of people on, including yourself, to talk about it. So I think we had an episode out the next day with yourself on there, and you've been a guest on SpyHards many times. That might be a good way of segueing people over. Check out the Bill episodes. There's quite a few of them. It gets about our Bill Koenig. What were my initial reactions? I was positive, and I still am. I think Amy Pascal I could take or leave, but ultimately it's progression, and progression is a good thing. It means something is moving. It means that the heart is pumping again. There was no life signs for a while. It was dead, Jim, and I'm glad we're going somewhere. What happens with it later, what Amazon do with it, we don't know. But I'm going to go into it with my arms open and be positive about it, and it's up to them to screw it up now.
Yeah, I think I was like semi trying to be positive in the episode we recorded talking about it, because I was trying to be pragmatic about, okay, like what could actually happen out of this? What are the things we could maybe see that are good? Because frankly, it's not good that we are getting a Daniel Craig Bond film every like 5 or 6 years. Like that's just not good for the life of a franchise. I think if you were to ask a 19 or 20-year-old at this point about James Bond, you'd get mostly blank stares. And Scott and I are used to going to Star Trek cons and being the youngest people or among the youngest people there, which does not speak to a healthy franchise. I think Bond needs to have that next push that like GoldenEye had, you know, especially with the video game, pulling in all these people who are 17, 18 years old and making Bond something that continues into the future. So I think like a better bankroll for films coming out on a better, you know, rotation is a good thing. My biggest concern, though, was fear when I saw this, that what makes Bond special is that, frankly, the Broccoli's are kind of strange. And so they work in elements. So you go, I would never see this in another franchise. I would never have a villain saying, I'll buy you a delicatessen in stainless steel. Like, that's not something that would ever clear a room full of, you know, execs in a studio, right? And so my fear was you would lose that kind of quirkiness that makes Bond so special. We may, I don't know. But all I can hope for at this point is that we don't wind up in Star Wars land where, you know, outside of something like Andor, which is really creator driven, Star Wars feels like just this kind of blahness of repeated imagery and ideas. I'm hoping that Amazon recognized that they basically have one shot at this to really win people over, and they give it everything. And that doesn't mean 27 execs in a room, you know, going over the script with a fine-tooth comb. What I'm hoping is it means like, we need a director like a Sam Mendes, for example, who was so vital to, you know, Skyfall, especially making Bond a really big brand again. I'm hoping they bring someone in. I know there's rumors of like Alfonso Cuarón. Don't know if that happens, but that would be great. It's a step in sort of the auteur-driven direction, which Bond may need to go forward, because I don't know that I trust them to make kind of disposable, in a sense, journeyman-directed Bond films. There's too much disposable action stuff on streaming these days that I go, I don't want that for Bond. That's scary to me.
Well, I did think, in my own view, that after the Amazon announcement, there's this event called CinemaCon, which is done in Las Vegas, and the studios talk to the owners of theater chains. And Amazon MGM had not been going to that event. This year they did go, and it was only a brief mention. They talked about how the new producers were in London working on, you know, the first Amazon Bond movie, which suggests that it is going to be a British-based production, because I know immediately after the February announcement, I saw Bond fans who were fretting that it might lose its British feel under Amazon. So it appears they do want to retain British feel of Bond films. Amazon last year bought Bray Studios. I don't know if Bray is big enough to be the home base of a Bond movie, but Amazon clearly wants to make movie and TV shows in England, probably because of all the generous tax breaks the
Yeah.
UK provides. But still, it that seems to be an indication that it will be a British-based production.
They're also not dumb. They've looked at the international grosses of the Daniel Craig Bond films, and yeah, domestically some of them did really well. But you compare that to what they were making internationally, and you go, okay, we need these movies to continue to be gangbusters in the UK and Europe.
Yeah, very much so. So, is there anything you guys would like to add? Any more thoughts
in terms of Bond and Amazon?
About Bond in general?
I think ultimately movement and progression is a good thing, as I said before. I think we're going somewhere, and they've got 60 years to look back on and reflect. Hopefully, we have another 60, and it goes a completely different way, and everyone loves it. That's my positive approach to all of this.
Yeah, I would say even if there is a bit of a dip in Bond for a while, that kind of still makes the franchise interesting. The Bond franchise has always been interesting, whether it's at its high levels or its low. And at some points, those levels change. People did not look at On Her Majesty's Secret Service as a home run when it was released, and now we do. And so I think, if a franchise is going to have a life, you want it to be interesting at the very least. And my biggest fear is generic filmmaking versus a swing that maybe is a little too strange or people don't latch on to immediately.
Yeah, my own personal view is I think under the Broccoli-Wilson family, I think they had hit a dead end, particularly after No Time to Die, and it just wasn't going anywhere. And there's a famous mystery story where the clues were all in plain sight, and with Eon and Bond, the clues were all in plain sight. Because how long can you say, well, we've got to evaluate what's happening in the future? And actually, one of the plainer quotes actually came from all people, Greg Wilson, son of Michael G. Wilson. He was being interviewed about that reality show, and then he said. Then he got asked about the next Bond movie. He said, nothing in development. There will be someday, but nothing going on right now. That was a little plainer comment than what we had been getting from the top people at Eon. So it's that was really telling, but I think a lot of Bond fans kind of passed it over because that's not what they wanted to hear.
And don't worry, folks. If Bond doesn't do it for you for a little bit, there are still a lot of other spy movies out there you can enjoy. There are Mission Impossible, there are Jason Bourne. There's plenty to tuck into.
Yeah, very much so. You know what? That's probably a good place to bring this to a close. Scott and Cam, you've been great, and I hope you had a good time on this interview.
Always a pleasure, Bill.
Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, thanks everyone, and thanks to our audience for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon on the 007 Files. Take care.